Welcome, everyone, and it's such a thrill to see so many survivors here today. I cannot tell you, it's almost brought me to tears, so thank you for being with us. We also have our dear friend Moniz Newman with us, and Moniz, just make yourself known. Moniz is the National Consultant for the International March of the Living. This year, Holocaust Museum LA partnered with the extraordinary March of the Living led by Moniz on a journey to Poland, and we're now actually planning our March of the Living Holocaust Museum LA 2024 delegation and planning the itinerary. So if any of you have any questions, please see Moniz. And I believe we also have some information on the desk outside, so please be sure to take a flyer or the information with you. It's been a remarkable writing journey that began last year with a 2-part memoir writing workshop, which morphed into this tremendous writing group, the Shoah Legacy Writers, a second-generation experience. And what an experience it's been, both intellectually and emotionally. Through deep dialogue and discussion on the process of writing, we have all learned a great deal. And on a personal level, I cannot thank you all more. Thank you so much. We are a group of 12, Henry Slucky, Debbie Beckman, Chaim Singer-Franks, Sharon Wise, Anna Packhow, and our 6 writers who are panelists with us this afternoon. Priscilla Schneider, Dr. Melvin Greenspan, Fern Topa-Salka, Ellie Eldon, Dina Paul Goodman, and Dr. Paul Schneider. Priscilla's parents were Holocaust survivors who met after the war. She and her brother were born in Budapest, Hungary. They came as refugees to the United States, and she grew up in Los Angeles. She's married with 4 children and has 6 grandchildren, and has been working as a docent here at Holocaust Museum LA for the past 10 years, which she proudly states is one of her most rewarding experiences. Dr. Melvin Greenspan was born to 2 Shoah survivors, Tamara and Jacob. He is the only child. Both his parents suffered throughout their survivor lives. He was a first-hand witness to the manifestation of the damage of one's inner self, and has been searching for a personal place of peace in his adult journey as a second generation. His aunt Esther is one of the founders of this museum. Fern Topa-Salka. Fern's parents married before the war, lived in, then escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto, lived in and survived living in a wall, then a sewer, and then enslavement on a German pig farm. She is an only child, born in New York City, raised in Los Angeles. She is an involved mother and grandmother, a practicing lawyer, a sometimes writer, and a former synagogue president. Ellie Eldon. Ellie is a global citizen in the technology domain. Ellie has lived, studied, and worked in Israel, France, Boston, Japan, and now he lives and works in Los Angeles. He is the son of Holocaust survivors from Poland and Romania. Ellie has 3 sons and 3 grandsons. Dina Paul Goodman. Dina is the daughter of one of the younger child survivors, Marie Kaufman, who died in 2022 last year. She has always embraced her mother's dedication to Holocaust Museum LA and other educational institutes to promote tolerance and educate the youth. The journey of legacy to never forget is a message she is passionate about. Dina has 2 young adult children. She was born and raised in Los Angeles, and she has a private practice that caters to pelvic health physical therapy. And Dr. Paul Schneider is the youngest son and nephew of 2 sisters from Poland who survived the Holocaust in the Soviet exile, lost their parents to hunger in Uzbekistan, their brother to the Soviet army, and who made a pact to never speak of such things to their future children. Luckily, they slowly lost their willpower to keep their oath. He practices internal medicine, and when in a good mood, he practices his classical music. Next week, families and friends were gathered together from across the globe to welcome Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, into our homes and begin a 10-day period of reflection, thinking about our families, our friends, and especially those we've loved and those we've lost. And we will renew our commitment to kindness, to decency, and to respect to others. It is my honor to dedicate this program in remembrance to the parents of our speakers today: Tamara Epstein and Jacob Greenspan, Rosa and George Schneider and Genia Wolf, Lillian Shaw Eldin, Marie Kaufman and Anna and Michael Kaufman, Ben and Rose Topaz, Andras Fleischner Takash, and Ava Klein Takash. Forgive me, Priscilla. To everyone here today and beyond, we wish you all a happy, healthy, and of course, a very sweet new year. It is now my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Michele Berenbaum, who will explore with us the significance of documenting family histories that not only influence our lives today, but the importance of how it can shape the future for all of us. And then he will call upon our writers to read their pieces. Dr. Michele Berenbaum is the director of the Ziggy Ziering Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust, and he's a distinguished professor of Jewish studies at the American Jewish University. He is the author and editor of 20 books. He was also the executive director of the second edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica. He was project director overseeing the creation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the first director of its research institute. And later, he served as president and CEO of the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation. Dr. Berenbaum, we welcome you. It's an absolute privilege, and we thank you for moderating this afternoon's panel.
I think we can say of Michele that in what they say in Hebrew, kishma keni. As her name, so she is, and that is your gold, if not platinum. Let me also say one other thing. For those of you for whom this is the first visit to the Los Angeles Holocaust Museum, you can always say you've been given a warm welcome. I'm only going to speak very briefly because I have had the privilege of reading what you're about to hear, and I don't want to stand in the way of what you're about to hear. I just want to say three things. A generation or a generation and a half ago, we were worried about whether the Holocaust would be remembered. That problem has, in essence, been solved. But the interesting thing historically is that those who went through the Holocaust were deeply and profoundly committed to its being remembered. Even those who did not live and knew they would not live believed very deeply and very profoundly that Jewish history would live. And consequently, they wrote diaries and memoirs, they collected archives, and they wrote a whole range of things to make sure that we had the tools by which it was being remembered. Our challenge in this generation is not whether the Holocaust will be remembered, but it's how it will be remembered. And that may even be a more formidable task than the task of remembering the event itself. Secondly, what you're going to hear is you're going to hear a double element of what is involved in memory. Memory sometimes is painful and traumatic. It is deep, but it also can be transformative. And equally important, if you confront memory, it can be empowering and giving you a measure of enormous freedom. So I want you to listen to the ways in which these descendants of survivors, we can't call the second generation any longer children of survivors because these are not children, they are a combination of not only descendants, but now we can say that we've reached a stage where we're also ancestors. So consequently, when we think of descendants of the Holocaust and their experience, the burden of the moral responsibility for remembrance has fallen strongly on them because they bear it in their genes. But the other part of the second generation, and this is key, is they have to confront a memory that has been bequeathed to them, often in silence. And they have to deal with the spoken and the unspoken, and that becomes a mystery that's at the center, at the core of their being. They also, in a very deep way, are a statement of triumph, because the last echo of the Holocaust was not death, but rebirth and life. One statistic, the largest, the most significant birth rate in all of Europe in the aftermath of the war was in the DP camp called Bergen-Belsen, which was on the site of the concentration camp. Holocaust survivors decided to bring new children into the world at a time when they did not know where they were going to live, what the future would be, what the world would be like, but they understood that the deepest response to death is to recreate life. In that sense, some of you who know my work understand that I believe that the 10th of Av, historically, the day after the destruction, is the most important day in the Jewish calendar and in terms of Jewish memory. Last point is that when we were creating, years ago, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, we had a problem: how do you end? And we played with different endings. And finally we said that the ending came to us by a very peculiar New York detective series that some of you in this audience will be old enough to remember. The New York detective series was called The Naked City. And the only thing people remember about The Naked City was the last line of The Naked City. There are 8 million people in this naked city, 8 million stories, and this has been one of them. When we come to the Shoah, we have to recall that it is story after story after story after story. It is the personal dimension that is the most critical dimension of it all. And for every story that is told, there is story after story after story that is untold. So we give Michele a great deal of thanks and a great deal of gratitude, and we give our panelists a great deal of gratitude for the courage to face their past and to use it as a tool for creativity, and now today to share it with us. So without further ado, let's begin. Priscilla, why don't you begin?
So, I did not know my parents were Holocaust survivors. When I was 13 in school, we started the World War II unit. On a side panel of our history book was a photograph of Hungarian Jews arriving in Auschwitz. I stared at the photograph and wondered, my parents are Hungarian Jews. Do they know about this Holocaust thing? Have they ever heard about this Auschwitz place? At dinner that evening, against my brother's advice, I asked my parents if they had ever heard of Auschwitz. Shocked, my father demanded to know how I had heard of Auschwitz. I told him it was in my history book. After a short silence, he quietly said, "You know, you are named after my mother, Piroshka. She died in Auschwitz." Stunned, I suddenly realized this was no longer a history book, but my history, and that this was at the heart of the unspoken horror and silence in my family. And I fled, feeling as if the floor was opening up and I was falling into a cauldron of stew that I have been mucking about in ever since. I did not want this history. I wanted to be American. I wanted to be like everyone else, except I wasn't, never could be, and strive as I have throughout my life, never have been. As the years raced on, I've often thought, maybe if I go to Auschwitz, I can excise the ghosts, find some sort of peace. But although I've had many opportunities to go there, which is at the heart of my family's annihilation, I could never bring myself to do it. Then this past fall, I was invited to be part of the delegation of the March of the Living, and I thought, okay, it's time. I need to do this. So I left my family behind and arrived in Krakow alone. Although acquainted with a few on the trip, I did not feel really connected to anyone. However, my lack of feeling connected was quickly dispelled as I was enveloped into the arms of one of the most loving, supportive, and fun groups I have ever experienced, walking, touring, eating, and genuinely enjoying being together. And then finally the day came to go to Auschwitz. On the drive there, my nerves were completely on edge, and I was anxious and afraid. When we arrived, it was hard for me to focus. I was lightheaded and nauseous, and I wondered if I was even going to be able to walk into the camp at all. And then suddenly someone took my hand and told me to breathe, and I grasped that hand and held on. Unbeknownst to me, 3 in our party were doctors. This man, recognizing my distress, was one of them, Mel, who is sitting right there. And I will be forever grateful for his care at the beginning of that day. But as the day progressed, I was able to let go of his hand and went on my own, almost marching. When we got to the gas chamber, I took a deep breath and entered, alone, and spoke to my grandmother, Piroshka, who was murdered more than a decade before I was born, telling her I was there. I walked through slowly, deliberately breathing in the dust. And as I exited, I had this surreal feeling that my grandmother, Piroshka, was led in there to her death, and I, her legacy, her granddaughter, named Piroshka in her memory, almost 80 years later, walked out. When I got home, my youngest daughter, Katie, aged 26, asked to see the photos of the camps. She is an impatient person who doesn't like to go to the movies because she can't fast forward. So I was surprised when she went through the photos and videos slowly. I had filmed Mel at Treblinka telling the story of his family's destruction. And to my amazement, she watched all 14 minutes of it, even going back to make sure she didn't miss anything. Near the end, my eyes filled with tears, and she said, "Mom, are you crying?" I choked out a yes. And instead of the usual eye roll, she took my hand, and we finished watching his testimony together. We sat there quietly afterwards. Then she looked at me, said, "I love you, Mom," kissed me, and went home. I'm not sure how going to Auschwitz will move me forward. My initial reaction is that it's not something I really want to repeat. Yet, when my daughter said she was ready to go there, I took a deep breath and said, "I will go with you." And now I know I can.
I think we're going to have to go out of order, and we're going to turn to Mel.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, joining us this afternoon. The inspiration, if you will, for the piece I'm going to read was I was part of the delegation at the March of the Living with the Holocaust Museum. And our guide, Tomasz, was touring us through various concentration camps. And he kept on using a phrase, and it stuck with me. And I started writing this piece over in Poland. And the phrase he used was a franchise operation. That's the title of my piece. A franchise operation, or how to perfect the industrialization of hate in an ambivalent and in a different world. A franchise operation, an opportunity of a 1,000-year empire. Join our growing enterprise. Only the best engineers and accountants, only the best doctors and scientists, Only the best administrators and managers. Glory to the Übermensch. Glory to the deserved. A franchise operation. The plans are meticulous and standardized. Alterations and changes have been made in real time. Now with cookie-cutter precision, material requirements are set. Land is being acquired. Startup costs are well defined. Labor requirements, food intake, and productivity schedules established. Oh, the glory. A franchise operation. Join our growing industrial complex. Invest in the production and distribution of a wide array of products. International investment, big profits, abundant natural resources, a steady stream of asset acquisition and allocation, creative funding programs, endless cheap labor, subjugation to the Untermensch, subjugation of the undeserved, extermination of the Juden. A franchise operation. Build it and they will come. Transportation networks in place. One-way tickets. Free transportation. Oh, yes. A franchise operation. Charming, welcoming flower gardens. Inviting musical performances. We have thought of everything. Who could resist? What could go wrong? A franchise operation. Showers, haircuts, louse removal, selections, uniforms, bullets, blood, gas, smoke, ash. Glory to the Übermensch. A franchise operation. 2,843,508 Jewish persons, hundreds of thousands, non-Jewish Poles and Slavs, Romas, Sintis, asocials, black mixed race German people, disabled people, Freemasons, gay people, Jehovah's Witnesses, political opponents and trade unionists. Glory to the Übermensch. Glory to the 1,000-year empire. Glory to the franchise operation. Thank you.
I call this borrowed stories. It was the story of their lives, but it guided my life. I wasn't even born, but I remember. I know the sting of the cold air as my mother and her brother walk, one behind the other, each careful not to touch, speak, or acknowledge each other on the treacherous streets that are Warsaw in 1942. It could be 43 or even 40. I know the stories, but not the dates. I feel their pain, I see the scenes, but their stories come out in pieces, and there are no photos, so their journey through hell is a cracked tableau in my mind. Warsaw is a city I have never visited, the home of my parents and their parents and the other dead relatives who could have peopled my life, but didn't. Like my mother's brother, who never lived to be my uncle. They are strangers to me, but their stories are mine to imagine. For as long as I can remember, I have been given the cliff notes of how my parents survived the Holocaust. There are many terrible stories, but this one is the worst. I think of it simply as keep on walking. I take it as our family motto, my personal mantra. I understand that these words are my parents' instructions to me and my obligation to them. The story begins as my blonde mother trails her blonde brother on the sidewalks where Jews may not walk, hiding in plain sight, walking as if they had lived there all their lives, which they had. Coat sleeves unsullied by yellow armbands, which would mark them as Jews, which they were. They bravely make their way through the urban minefield as if it is a stroll on the Champs-Élysées, except for the dead bodies of fallen Jews lying in the street. A brown-suited, brown-booted young man with a blazing red iron cross on his cap appears, pulls my uncle aside, pulls him off the sidewalk into the gutter, reserved for Jews and rats, pulls him out of the path of the ordinary, out of life going forward, towards the dungeons of the doomed. My mother knows her brother's life is over, sees his sweet face disappear, remembers how they played and talked and shared all of their lives, feels herself crumble, scream, reach out, shrink, and die herself. But she doesn't even blink. She does not stop. She keeps on walking. 4 decades later, my own husband dies suddenly. I sit in front of his casket with our 5-year-old boy on my lap as the funeral prayers are chanted, and I remember that my mother kept on walking. I pull my child close to me and I whisper in his ear, "This is not going to get us. Do you hear me? We are going to be fine." I'm always fine. How can I complain that life is hard when my mother kept on walking, when my father hid in a hole in a wall? Not a metaphor, but a real hole in the wall of the attic apartment where my mother pretends to be living alone. I've heard their stories many times. These were the stories of my childhood, my Grimm's fairy tales. Grim indeed. I know a lot, but I do not know what it really means to live as my father did for over a year below the streets of Warsaw, hiding in a sewer. So I become obsessed with watching movies, reading books, hearing stories that tear my heart apart. I need to fill in the missing pieces. I need a picture book of my parents' journey. But there are no pictures, and filling out the stories will be my life's project. I am haunted by what I can imagine. I am haunted by what I cannot imagine. The path of destruction led by the Nazis is far, deep, and wide. As a divorce mediator, I help others to let go, but I cannot let go of what the Nazis did to my parents. When I think about it, and I think about it a lot, I am enraged. I return again and again to therapy. I turn to yoga, I meditate, I ruminate. Pause, breathe, become my new mantra. But keep on walking feels more natural. Even so, I persevere. Maybe by the time I die, I will have calmed down. I doubt it. In the meantime, I write Holocaust poems.
We told you that there are multiple stories, and we told you the truth. Dr. Schneider, Paul Schneider, please.
I hope you'll forgive me for talking about a story which is somewhat tangential to the Holocaust, but so that you understand the connection, I will preface it by saying my mom, Rosa, and my Auntie Jeannie, whose eldest son is here in the audience, they were born in a small city in the extreme southeast of Poland, and they were 10 and 7 years of age when the Nazis marched into their town, Sanok. They swam across the great river called the Rzeka San, holding hands with their mother and father because they didn't swim, didn't know how to swim. The Nazis shot machine gun fire over their heads. Between the water and the machine gun, they made their way to safety and survived in Soviet exile, where their parents died in Uzbekistan, and my mother buried them by the side of the road. With that as preface, I hope you will be able to understand my somewhat tangential story. The V8 engine in that Dodge Polara was plenty powerful to pull our family up over the long incline, after which we could have a view of farm fields softly merging into the blue Pacific horizon. Mom and Dad sat in the front and I in the back. It was a big car that we jokingly likened to a boat, and my mother said it would protect us in an accident just due to its size. The Ventura Freeway gently unrolled as we made the 40-mile trek from LA to Camarillo to visit my 17-year-old sister, Irene. I remember driving across its huge campus of Spanish buildings, looking to find the right one where she lived now. Being a young boy of about 6 or so in 1970, this made quite an adventure for a Sunday morning, at least for the small boy I was then. What I knew at the time was that my sister was sick with something, but nothing I understood. The sickness made her get really angry and yell at everyone at home. Mom and Dad told me that much as they wanted to keep her at home, Irene couldn't live there anymore and needed special care. That's why we were going to visit her. I remember that Mama used to cry a lot, especially on the phone to Auntie Jeannie, always in her dark kitchen late at night, saying over and over, Hub Moirum, I'm afraid. Mama said that Irene got sick because she got mixed up with the wrong group of friends in high school, but I couldn't understand how friends could make someone like that. I remember walking onto the ward where a nurse had to turn a big clunky lock to let us in and being terribly frightened by the people. Some were walking around in robes and trying to touch us. Some were moaning and drooling, some shouting. Eventually, we found Irene and spent some time with her in a quieter place. She didn't shout at us anymore, but she wasn't right either. She was mostly just quiet now. As we began the trip home and traversed that same incline, my thoughts turned to trying to understand what I had experienced. What I could not know then was that my sister was to go on to experience a lifetime of severe mental illness, and I would go on to a lifetime of trying, sometimes fruitlessly, to help her. Hers was not an easy case, and she was largely resistant to every method of treatment. She had persistent delusions that Nazis were attacking her, even that I was a Nazi. But whatever frustration I experienced must have been nil compared to what our mother felt. Holocaust orphan that she was, with a grand total of a third-grade education before the war, she made her way to America as a war refugee with my Auntie Jeannie. A prevalent theory at that time was the so-called schizophrenogenic mother, that mothers were to blame for their sick children with schizophrenia. How she could have possibly dealt with that cruel accusation, a woman who loved all her children as if they were her only hope for life, is beyond me. Moreover, the doctors of the time told her to give up on that daughter as a lost cause and just concentrate on the others. My mother could never do that. Many years later, after my mom's death, my Auntie Jeannie confided in me that Mama had spent time in a psych ward herself after reaching the shores of America at the age of 18. The burden of the war, the loss of her parents, it had just been too much. I never knew. Irene at 17 and Mama at 18. Mom must have recovered to a large extent, as I never saw her to be at that severity in my life. But in retrospect, she clearly had what I would understand to have been post-traumatic depression and completely untreated in those days. Irene, though you are gone, I feel closer to you than ever, for I am now able to talk to you in ways that you could not understand while you were alive. I long to tell you that it was my own foolish vanity as a doctor that led me to intervene to try to help you after Mom and Dad were gone. I thought my own medical knowledge gave me a chance of beating the schizophrenia and making a better life for you. I had good intentions, but I was wrong. I was no match for that terrible disease. I mourn you and the life you were robbed of. Mama, I am the same little boy in the car with you that day. I am still here, and now I understand everything. I am angry that you had to endure tragedy after tragedy, and I love you more than ever. When the saving remnant of our people emerged from the Khurban Europa, they were not unscathed. Much though we model our finery and paint pictures of happy domesticity, Our wounds refuse to be dressed and covered. They fester and continue to cause pain even unto later generations. When the last words of the suffering of the 6 million will be written, Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mavorach. When the last whispered words of the survivors will be spoken, Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mavorach. When the last remnant trauma of the ensuing generations are finished and no one is left to remember, Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mavorach. When all that remains are these words on the page, Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mavorach. I pray that he who makes peace in his high places makes peace in the souls of my beloved mother and sister. And for us the living, may he heal our broken hearts now and forevermore. Amen.
Please take a breath with me, all of you, since we are all alive in here together in this beautiful space that's the Children's Memorial, one of my mother's favorites. I'm going to share 3 vignettes with you based on stories I learned from my mother, Marie Kaufman, who was only 18 months when she was first in hiding, with her parents, Anna and Michele, in France, 1942, during World War II. Michele, my grandfather, lived under the house of their rescuers during daylight hours until the occupation ended there in August of 1944. The power of kindness. It was no longer safe and too cold during the winter months for Michele to hide in the cave, Lorach. So he came to the Catholic family's home where my mother and grandmother were living. A stack of firewood disguised the entrance into the space he hid in. By day, snug and curled up, rigid and silent, my grandfather lay on hard wood in the dark space under the house. By night, he crept inside to snuggle with my grandmother and be with my mother, speaking Yiddish or Polish together and not in French, so my mother would not understand. Whispering words, my grandparents shared little more than discussed what might come next, should there be a next. Getting by day, night by night, the time seemed to all blend together. Silenced by adults. A child learns what they are taught, and fear was my mother's middle name. My grandmother, Anna, would tell my mother, be a good girl, behave, be quiet, and speak softly. My mother recounted her days in hiding at her adopted Catholic family's home in the village of Millars, France. Farm life was quiet for the most part, with so much space to move about, and yet she was not free to move about and could not cross the road for fear that the boogeyman would come and get her and take her away. She could not get the emotional, energetic softness from her mother, who worked during the day in the fields gathering foods for the others in the village. But she did get the emotional attunement from the family of teenagers that watched after her by day. They gave her smiles, they gave her hugs, make-believe scenes with doll houses, trying to give a young child something that felt like normal life. Surrounded by lavender fields and roaming chickens by day, Marie was not free to roam at any time. The wonderful teens that babysat her during the day taught her how to play games and kept her busy with milk carts and dollhouses to build and create. Anything to keep her safe and entertained and away from trouble. Terrors of the boogeyman taking her away from her family kept her up at night. She saw her father, my grandfather, late at night when it was safe for him to come home out from under the house. Le gendarme, the policeman. He came knocking at the door every morning, making his rounds. His heavy, hard-soled, dark shoes polished and untouched. Black belt snug around his waist, solid baton on one hip, and a gun on the other hip, his peaked hat always in alignment with his pointed nose. Anna and Michal anticipated those even, jolting, firm, loud knocks on the front door and tried hard not to be home for those knocks or confrontations. One day, the policeman caught Anna and little Marie at home before their morning routine. Marie had not been dropped off at the neighbor's home while Anna went to gather vegetables on the farm. Marie was only a year old, her mother clinging her tight to her breasts, while she stood face to face with the policeman that came by each day. He was a man of little words, but his eyes told his story. He said, "Don't say anything I don't want to hear, or I will have to take you with me. And don't say you have a Jewish man as your husband, or I will need to take him with me too. And understand, I am a man you may not be able to trust, but you have no choice." Every day he asked the same questions, asking for Marie's papa, but she did not know of a papa because she was taught she had two mothers until after the war, so that she would not give away that her father was alive.
And last, but certainly not least, Eliel Dunn.
Thank you all for braving the heat and honoring us with your presence today. The name of the piece is Rising from the Ashes. The sun was shining, the sky was blue, but there was always a cloud hanging over the home where I grew up. A cloud of silence, a cloud of mystery. The center of our home was mother's kitchen with the gefilte fish, kishke, borscht, pirogalach, and mamaliga. Jewish life was all around us. The synagogue yard across the street was our playground, celebrating the holidays, singing the songs, but still there was always this cloud hanging over our home. In the intermix of languages surrounding us, Yiddish, Hebrew, German, there were a few words that repeatedly echoed. Red Yiddish soll de Kinder nicht verstehen. Speak in Yiddish so that the kids do not understand. So my brother and I, we learned over time to live with this mystery. Life continued. We grew up, built new families, raised kids, and all the while something was missing, a story, a history, an identity. Our parents were not getting younger. Our beloved mother passed away. And on the last few months of our beloved father, the cloud, at last, had been lifted. The stories came to light. A tapestry of stories, stories of courage, stories of perseverance, stories of utter destruction, stories of rising from the ashes. There was my father, a soldier in the Polish army, on a battlefield in Western Poland, fighting the Nazi Germans as they invaded Poland, wounded by German fire. There was my mother, kicked out of her home in northern Romania by the Romanian military, forced to walk with her large family 200 miles to the killing fields of Transnistria. There were three of my uncles who left their homes and traveled to join the Soviet army on battlefields in the Eastern Front, fighting the Nazi Germans as they invaded the Soviet Union. The three of them killed in battle. There was my father in a Soviet gulag in the Arctic Circle in Siberia, where he was detained by the Soviets after crossing from Poland when the Nazi Germans were approaching his hometown. And there were two large, beautiful Jewish families that were destroyed. In Treblinka, in Majdanek, in the Miedzirezhets ghetto, in Transnistria, and on the battlefields. The war has ended, and there they were, surrounded by death and destruction. And they rose from the ashes. It is said in the book of Deuteronomy, I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life, that you and your offspring may live. They chose life.
We're going to do two things now. Number one, I'm going to ask the panelists a couple of questions, and then we're going to turn to you for questions. Now that we've seen Michelle's work, I think that not Michelle's work. We've seen the work that Michele has been the midwife to. So let's give Michele a round of applause. Okay. So let me ask a very simple question, which will have a complex answer. What did writing about this bring out in you?
I think for me, this is an act of liberation. Personally, it's like something inside of me was locked in some sort of a mental jail for all my life. And with the help of Michele and my dear colleagues here, was able at last to set myself free and have these stories come out. In general, I think that we are serving an important role here, which is along the lines that you said, Michael, is to keep the flame of truth about the Holocaust alive, lest it becomes a myth. And this is why it's so important for me.
I think it's on. Woo! There's a chair closer. You know, finding my own voice has been really hard. And especially in personal writing. And I encourage, you know, some of my friends that are here that are writers. It's really hard. I'm, you know, a professional and you know, in the medical field, and I can write and write and write. And to find a balance of writing to share that either isn't too personal or not is really hard. So my mother was a big speaker, and many of you knew her, and she shared many of her stories. And to now, you know, feel like you're stepping into big people's shoes. You know, I still feel like a kid. And it's interesting. So I encourage the younger generations to step into their own livelihood. Really, it's about, you know, feeling your aliveness and embodying it in a different way. And you can have your tears, and that's fine too. But to share is so powerful, and I saw it in her, and that's my truth.
For me, I'm obsessed with the subject. There isn't another subject for me. And if I write about it, then the people around me don't have to listen to it all the time. And I get to say what I can't get, I can't get rid of it. It's the story of my life, even though I didn't live it.
For me, specifically, writing this piece allowed me a focus point for anger and rage that I have in me. It allowed me to organize it and produce something that hopefully resonates.
You know, I think we all have to do the best with what God gave us, right? And for better or for worse, this is what God gave me. And my writing is about my struggle with God and trying to salvage faith and relationship with Him or with God, no matter what He gave me.
No way out. Well, my story is a little bit different than everybody else's in that I grew up in silence and in hiding here in the United States, where no one was supposed to know that I'm Jewish. And for me, coming to work at this museum, putting a mezuzah on my door, writing these kind of pieces, and with the mentorship of Michele and with Moniz, who has given me so much positive response, I feel like I can finally relax and just be who I am.
Again, the intriguing thing is that what telling the story does is a story in and of itself, and a very important story in and of itself. I'm just going to say one word about I grew up in silence also. I'm not the child of survivors, but I was born in post-war America and educated in Hebrew-speaking yeshivot, where the content of Zionism was the Hebrew language. And we were told that, in essence, we were told that we were the generation of whipped cream and ice cream that had to make up for a great generation. And we only heard words, death, camps, murder, but no story. And it's only much later that we heard a story. So silence has its own power and its own haunting power in a very different way. But we, on the other hand, were told that we had this unspoken burden to carry on and to proclaim and to intensify. So silence has its own power. Let me ask a second question to each of you. We heard about your journey back. Have any of you gone back? And what did that represent? To the lands from which your ancestors came.
I'll start. So I wear a beard out of memory for my grandfather. I like to say Kaddish in Ashkenazi Hebrew out of memory for them who are not here anymore. And along those same lines, when my mother told me the ground should only open and swallow Poland, I took her words at face value and decided I would never go there. My wife was in the audience, knows that we came very close. At one point, I was nearly seduced to bring her and our daughter, and I held myself back out of restraint and said, no, out of respect for my mother, I won't go there.
This journey was fortuitous because being part of the delegation allowed me to visit the hometowns of my mother and my father. And I needed to do that. I needed to see what they would have seen. I needed to smell what they might have smelled. I needed to hear the language that they spoke in the native tongue. My expectations were not very high, but my experience in doing that opened up wounds, allowed some healing, and for certain did not cement Poland as my formative roots.
I am fortunate to have been to Yad Vashem with my grandmother and my mother and her sister and me, so we had 3 generations. And, you know, being written up in the LA Times and having so many photographs that my mother had and that we were fortunate to have and that are here hosted in this museum here. So for me, and I've been back to France. I haven't been back to my mother's hometown, and look forward to sharing that one day with my kids and with any of you too. So.
For me, Poland is a Jewish cemetery, and I have no interest in going. I have no interest in making peace. I think that there was some effort for some time in saying that they were interested in Jewish culture and klezmer and other superficial ways of addressing it. It didn't last. Its country is once again anti-Semitism rising. I didn't want to go then. I don't want to go now. I think that probably my story is a little different than a lot of the people here in that there was not silence in my home. The story was told, and as I said, it was told over and over again. And so I didn't have that sense of secrecy. But of course, there's a price to pay when stories are told because they haunt my life. So one way or another, the nature of the event is so horrific that it will affect you whether it was silent or not. I just had to deal with a home where I do not remember a time in my life when I didn't know what happened. It never existed.
For me, the guiding principle is captured in a verse from Exodus chapter 1, verse 12, which says about the story of Israelites in Egypt. וכאשר יענו אותו כן ירבה וכן יפרוץ. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. For me, the key experience in going back to Poland, which I did in 2006, was to walk proudly with a shirt with a big Star of David for all to see as a proud Jew coming back to represent my family in front of all the people there. Here we are, we stand strong, we are proud, and we are not giving up ever. So my 3 sons went there to visit. I went there, I went to the hometowns of my family, so that was for me very important as a statement.
I like that so much I may change my mind.
Okay, let's take some questions, but please, no speeches. Yes, please.
Thank you. Very touching. And I resonate with most of you. Are you planning on publishing your work? About what? Publishing your work?
So many of the writings that you heard today actually are published on the Holocaust Museum LA's second generation website, so you can go there. They may be in a different format. And I will speak for myself. I have other little vignettes that I'm writing and hope to put in a book, but I'm in healthcare and I would like to somehow combine it with some of my psychological writings that I've done too and see if I can come up with something else. And I have some fabulous writers and support that are actually here in this audience today. So I appreciate all of you and Michele.
We actually started as a memoir writing class, and it was a 2-part memoir writing course. And at the end of it, at the end of the second course, we thought, oh, now what? We didn't want to leave each other because we'd started doing this tremendous writing. And then we became the Shoah legacy writers, and we've been that ever since. And we've been meeting, I would say, every 5 to 6 weeks, and we meet at 10 or 11 o'clock, and sometimes we're there till 2 o'clock. And our conversations are almost as eloquent as our writings. And we've all learned so much from each other, and we've supported each other to where we are today. And it's absolutely.
I just want to stress that for me, it was less the writing, which I kind of do, I like to do, as the community. And I certainly, I feel a kinship. Nobody ever told me I wasn't loud enough, okay. I feel a kinship with people who have lived my life experience, and it's very profound, and it's as important as the writing itself to me.
For me, there are 2 main purposes for doing this. Number one, with all humility and respect, I believe that within our tribe, there's a lot to be desired in increasing the awareness within the community, especially the younger generations, of the knowledge about what happened. The other aspect is the universal story for beyond our community, just to draw some lessons from what happened, which essentially started with the idea of rejecting the concept of peaceful coexistence within a community and outside the boundaries of community, because eventually, what led eventually to the Holocaust and to the greater disaster was the fact that they came with this idea that there is no room for peaceful coexistence, that humanity is based on a constant struggle for living space. And I think we have to draw some of these lessons and teach them and try and relay this message as a universal message overall.
Any other questions? Moniz, come.
Firstly, I want to thank you for doing this. As somebody who's very much immersed in the Holocaust and you being now the torchbearers of memory, can I ask you about your children, the third Gs? Do they want to assume the same mantle?
There was a sense of lightness to what I grew up with. It's extremely important. I have two very young children. I have a almost 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, and I think every day about how I'm going to speak about this to them, how we do speak about it, even at their young age. I think it's so important for it not to get lost. I think it is very easy to get lost. And it was present in my life. It was present in Hebrew school for me and Sunday school. It was present at the schools I went to also. I don't know that that's the case anymore. I will see as I bring my children through the system, through LAUSD, I don't know. And I take that as something for myself extremely important, that I figure out how to make this present in their lives as something that will never happen again, that we will fight for, that it is our responsibility to honor our family and our legacies, and to always remember.
And to the question about our children, so I have a 21 and 26-year-old who would have loved to be here today and can't wait to see the recording. So they don't physically live here, but they've been invited to speak at their boobies, different events that she's been in. So I think when we invite, when we encourage, their voice will come out too in different ways, and I think that's really important. And it wasn't right. It wasn't until my mother passed that I really felt the need and the necessity. But they themselves are carrying, things forward in a different way now. And I think one day they will want to go to the March of the Living with me, as my first experience too.
Let me ask one final question of each of you. Could you have written this while your parents were alive?
This morning, I looked in the mirror and I said, I wish I did.
I doubt very much. I don't think I would have been able to do that when my parents were alive.
So in 1981, here at Fairfax High School, my teacher, Mr. Blackman, told us that he was creating the first Holocaust Studies course in a high school, certainly in LA Unified. And for that course, I interviewed my mom and told a different story. I wrote it while she was alive. So I guess the past is prologue. It prepared me to do what I'm doing now. But the story I wrote today, I could have never written that while Mom was alive.
I could have written this, what I read to you, for my aunt, Esther Zavorsky-Pratt, one of the founders of the Holocaust Museum in Los Angeles. But absolutely, I could not have shared that with my mother. She was so don't want to use the word damage, but she was damaged so deeply that it would have furthered injury to her?
The answer is no. I could not have written it when my parents were alive because they wanted to make sure that no one ever know that I was Jewish, because they felt that if anyone knew I was Jewish, I would be killed. And I hope that I have not passed that on. My son is standing right here. There he is. And I hope that I have instilled in my children the pride that was denied to me.
Well, this has been an extraordinary afternoon, and I want to thank each of our writers. I want to thank the woman who spurred this writing. And the highest tribute of all is to the audience who has endured the heat and who has really, I hope you all feel what I feel, which is that whatever we endured was well worth it.